much. It's really a pleasure to be here. I was looking forward to it, particularly in light of the fact that Rabbi Steinsaltz is my favorite topic to talk about. Rabbi Steinsaltz died a couple of days ago, 2 years and a couple of days ago. So this is his Yahrzeit week. And I had the privilege of spending an enormous amount of time with him. The way that happened was as follows. I read an essay that Rabbi Steinsaltz had written that was published in a magazine. And when I read this article, this essay, I thought to myself, this essay feels like he wrote Dear Arthur, and then wrote the essay. It really spoke to me profoundly. So what I did was I wrote him a letter. Rabbi Steinsaltz lived in Jerusalem. He was born in Jerusalem. I wrote him a letter, and I told him that I had read this essay and that if he ever came to New York, I would love to meet him. Well, I never got an answer. But about a year later, the phone rings, and there's a woman on the other end of the phone who says, Rabbi Steinsaltz is going to be in New York next week. How's Wednesday at 10? Well, for me, Wednesday at 10 was just fine to be able to get an audience with Rabbi Steinsaltz. And from that moment that I had that phone call until Wednesday at 10, I sat down to think about what are the biggest questions in my life. If this man is who they say he is, this extraordinary Jewish scholar and teacher of wisdom, then I had a great opportunity, and I wanted to go for broke. And I came up with 11 questions. And that first time that I saw him, we spent about 3 hours together, actually, and we got to 9 out of the 11 questions. So I did pretty well that particular day. So what happened was that shortly after that, I called the office in Manhattan where Rabbi Steinsaltz's trips to the United States are coordinated. It's called the Aleph Society. And I called the Aleph Society, and I said to the woman on the other end of the phone that I would like to work for Rabbi Steinsaltz. I said, I don't care what job you give me. I'm not looking for money. I just want to be able to put my head on the pillow at the end of the day and say to myself, I've worked and helped Rabbi Steinsaltz. Rabbi Steinsaltz's goal was let my people know. And I wanted to participate in that with him. And I offered myself to work to this woman. Well, she said to me, well, what can you do? And I said, well, I'll do anything you want. Give me the junkiest job, I'll do it. She said, well, that's very nice, but if you give me a little bit of a sense of your skills, maybe I could find something for you. And I said, believe me, forget about my skills. You give me any job you want. You give me the junkiest job that you have. If you want, I'll pick Rabbi Steinsaltz up at the airport at 5 o'clock in the morning. The woman said to me, you will? And from that day until the last trip that the rabbi took to the United States, I was there at El Al flight number 1 at 5:30 in the morning in New York in JFK Airport. And I had the job from that point on for a good few decades to be Rabbi Steinsaltz's chauffeur. I picked him up from the airport. I brought him to the lectures that he was going to give that week. I brought him to the hotel that he was going to stay at that week. And Rabbi Steinsaltz came into the United States about 5 times a year. So it means that I had an enormous amount of time with him. I was always happy when there was rush hour traffic in New York, because while most people hate rush hour traffic, when you're sitting next to Rabbi Steinsaltz and are able to ask him questions and have chats, the longer the rush hour traffic, the better it was for me. So it ends up that many years later, after my first encounter with the rabbi, I wrote this book called On the Road with Rabbi Steinsaltz, which tries to capture some of the experiences that I had talking to him, bringing him places, and so forth. And it ends up that there are people in his office in Jerusalem who hated the book. They really hated the book. And I found out why. They hated the book because many of them worked on the same floor where Rabbi Steinsaltz worked, but hadn't seen him for 20 years. Because when you're working in that office, you're busy, and the rabbi is busy, and you don't take up his time. But when the rabbi came to New York, he had some leisure time. We went out for coffee together. I took him out to dinner any number of times. I went to a clothing store. We bought him a new suit. We went to a hat store. We bought him a new hat. So I was doing things with the rabbi that the scholars that worked with him never had the opportunity to do. And they said, that's not Rabbi Steinsaltz. And of course, it is Rabbi Steinsaltz. In fact, I once told the rabbi that I heard that people in the office don't like my book very much. And he said, why? And I said, well, they say that it doesn't capture who you are. At which point Rabbi Steinsaltz said to me, well, even a one-celled animal, even a one-celled animal has more than one side. So he showed me one side of him, and he was able to put his feet up on the chair, on the table, and relax with me in between lectures. And we just had this grand old time together for many years. I don't know if there's anybody in the world who spent more time with Rabbi Steinsaltz than I did. So what I want to do this afternoon for a little bit of time is tell you some of the experiences I had with him and some of the things that he said to me. Sometimes I want to just tell you a one line that he said, and other times I want to tell you an anecdote. Let me begin with an anecdote. Rabbi Steinsaltz was in town in New York one particular time, and I got a phone call from a man, a rabbi who was the head of the yeshiva on Long Island. And the head of the yeshiva said to me, do I understand correctly that you're Rabbi Steinsaltz's chauffeur? And I said, yes, that's true. And he said, well, I understand that he's giving a lecture at a certain synagogue on Long Island tomorrow night. Is that true? And I said, yes, that's true also. So the head of the yeshiva said to me, well, my yeshiva is only a few blocks away from that synagogue. Wouldn't it be wonderful if you could stop by so the rabbi could say hello to the students in the school, in the yeshiva, who were studying with his Talmud? So I said to the man, the rabbi, yes, I agree, it would be wonderful, but we don't have the time. We have a very tight schedule, and I really don't have the time to stop at your synagogue, at your school. Well, the rabbi pleaded with me. He said to me, like I said, the students, they use Rabbi Steinsaltz's Talmud edition. It would be extraordinary if they would be able to meet him. And I said again, look, I can't stretch the time. I'm a very tight schedule. I don't know what traffic is going to be, so I can't bring him to you. So the Rosh Yeshiva, again, he was pleading with me, and he said, listen, all you have to do is come and drive up and put your car in front of the yeshiva. Come in for 30 seconds, just so the Rabbi Steinsaltz can say hello to the students and then leave. So I said to the rabbi who ran this yeshiva, okay, listen, I know exactly where your school is. It happens that I grew up not far from you, so I know precisely where the school is. If you can promise me that tomorrow afternoon at 2:00 in the afternoon, that your students will be ready to say hello to Rabbi Steinsaltz, we'll come in. And that's exactly what happened. The next day, we drive to Long Island, to the yeshiva. I park in the front of the school. Rabbi Steinsaltz and I walk into the school. All the students are waiting in the auditorium for us. And Rabbi gets up in front of the students at the podium to say hello. And he says the following to the students. He said, students, I don't know that much about that many subjects, but I do know a little bit about Torah study. So I'd like to give you some advice regarding your Torah study. My advice to you is this: make the lives of your teachers as miserable as you possibly can. Make your teachers' lives miserable. Try to trip them up on things that they say that might contradict themselves. He even gave the students a citation of a certain book that asks particularly difficult questions about the Torah portion each week. Make the lives of your teachers as miserable as you possibly can. Thank you very much, and off he walked. Well, the head of the yeshiva came up to the podium and says, Rabbi Steinsaltz, on behalf of the yeshiva, I'd like to thank you for spending a few moments here with us, but students, please don't take Rabbi Steinsaltz too literally. At which point Rabbi Steinsaltz, who was walking off the stage, turns around, comes back to the podium, grabs the microphone and says, "Students, I have been misquoted by journalists all of my career. I do not want to be misquoted here this afternoon. My advice to you is clear. Make the lives of your teachers as miserable as you possibly can. Again, thank you very much." And off he walked, and we went on. Now, of course, had the students taken his advice, tried to find out, to detect some contradictions in what the teachers were teaching, or tried to ask questions that were very difficult to ask, that would be a great class to be in, if you'd actually take their advice. But this is the way Rabbi Steinsaltz was. He was in some ways a troublemaker. You know, he was Orthodox rabbi. He's a Hasidic Orthodox rabbi, and he used to go to Reform temples to speak to the people to teach Talmud in a Reform synagogue, with men and women sitting together, with the men bareheaded, and he would teach. And I once heard somebody say to him, Rabbi Steinsaltz, how is it possible that you as a Hasidic ultra-Orthodox rabbi can go into a Reform temple and teach Talmud to women and men, and the men are bareheaded? How can you do it? And Rabbi Steinsaltz said, my teachers always taught me to relate to a person's essence and not to their shell. As long as I can do that, I don't get into trouble. I try to relate to a person's essence, not to their shell. He treated everybody the same. He had respect for everybody. He had high regard for everybody. And it didn't matter what you looked like on the outside. In fact, he once told me that he had an opportunity one time to see a peacock whose feathers were plucked. And he said, it taught me a great lesson, because a peacock without its feathers looks like a sick hen, a really sick hen. And he realized the lesson that he got from that was that you can put on the fanciest outside and it doesn't mean anything. He said, I relate to a person's essence and not to their shell. Now, there was a famous story about Rabbi Steinsaltz and the class that he taught in Jerusalem. Every Thursday morning for many, many years, Rabbi Steinsaltz taught a class at Hebrew University in Jerusalem to a group of academics from the school, professors from Hebrew University. And they were studying Talmud. And at one point, a certain professor approached Rabbi Steinsaltz and said, Rabbi Steinsaltz, I understand that you have this class every Thursday morning. I wonder, would you give me permission? Can I join the class? But before you say anything, let me tell you that I want you to know something about me. I eat bacon every Shabbos. Rabbi Steinsaltz said to the professor, every Shabbos? The guy said, yes, I eat bacon every Shabbos. Rabbi Steinsaltz said, why do you eat bacon every Shabbos? The professor said to him, during the week, I have a very, very busy schedule. I barely have enough time to grab a cup of coffee in the morning. But come Saturday morning, I have no classes. I make a big breakfast for myself. I include strips of bacon in my breakfast. And every single morning, every single Shabbos morning, I eat bacon with my breakfast. Rabbi Steinsaltz looked at the man and said to him, you know, it says in the Torah that you're supposed to honor Shabbos. I suppose it's better to honor Shabbos with bacon than not to honor Shabbos at all. And yes, you can join my class. He said, I'm not recommending that that's what people do, but if you're honoring Shabbos with bacon, you're maybe halfway there. Now, one of the times that I took Rabbi Steinsaltz out to dinner at a restaurant in Manhattan on 34th Street called Mendy's. It's a Fleischer restaurant. And whenever we went to a restaurant together, Rabbi Steinsaltz always wanted to go to the back of the room. And he wanted to have his back to the room so that nobody would see him, because he was a famous guy. And a lot of people, particularly in a kosher restaurant, might recognize him and interrupt the dinner, and it wasn't very pleasant. So we went into Mendy's, and we went to the last table in the back of the corner of the restaurant. And Rabbi Steinsaltz sat there again with his back to the room so that nobody saw him. And all of a sudden, somebody comes up to the table and says, Rabbi Steinsaltz? And he said, yes, do I know you? And he said, no, but I recognize you. I'm the mashgiach in this restaurant. I'm the man in this restaurant who makes sure that the restaurant is kosher. And he then pulled up a chair and sat with us. Nobody invited this man, but he pulls up a chair and sits with us. The man then says to Rabbi Steinsaltz, did you ever hear about my great-grandfather? A certain rabbi in Jerusalem who was a famous posek, a famous person who responded to questions. And Rabbi Steinsaltz says, of course I heard of this man. He was your great-grandfather? And the man said, yes, he was my great-grandfather. And I knew he was illustrious. I wanted to know if you knew him. Rabbi Steinsaltz said, I knew a lot about him. And he said to the young man, did you ever hear your great-grandfather's story about the egg? And the man said, no, I never heard of it. What's the story about the egg? And Rabbi Steinsaltz said, well, there was once a time, one evening, when a little girl who was 7 years old came to your great-grandfather's synagogue with a little bowl and one egg that was cracked open in the bowl. It seems that her mother had sent her through 3 different neighborhoods to finally get to this posek to ask him whether or not the egg was kosher. There may have been something in the egg there that was a little suspicious, and the little girl asked the rabbi, is the egg kosher? The rabbi said to the girl, yes, it's kosher, and off she went. Well, after she went, the students who were sitting there with the rabbi said to the rabbi, you never looked at the egg. How do you know it was kosher? We saw that you never even looked at the egg. And the posek responded and said, it says in our tradition, when it comes to a hardship, you have to respond in a lenient way. If there was a mother who sent a 7-year-old girl 3 neighborhoods with one egg to find out if that one egg was kosher, I knew that it was a hardship, and I didn't have to look at the egg. I told her that the egg was fine. So, it was a nice story because it reflects on Rabbi Steinsaltz's open-mindedness, and I liked retelling that story. Now, there was once a time when my daughter, who at the time was a teenager, today she's a mother with 2 children, but she was a teenager at that time, and she asked me whether or not I could arrange to have her have a conversation privately with Rabbi Steinsaltz. So, of course, I asked Rabbi Steinsaltz if I was able to do that, and he said yes. And the next time I was in the office, I brought my daughter, her name is Miriam, and Miriam and Rabbi Steinsaltz went into this room to have a conversation together. It happens that my daughter brought a tape recorder with her and recorded the entire conversation that they had. One of the questions my daughter asked Rabbi Steinsaltz was the following. It happens that I was divorced. My ex-wife and I are the parents of Miriam. And so her parents were divorced. So she said to Rabbi Steinsaltz, if, as it said, God in heaven matches this boy with this girl and this girl with this boy, and if it's true that everybody has a beshert, everybody has somebody in the life who's the partner. My daughter said to Rabbi Steinsaltz, if that's the case, why did my parents get divorced? Well, Rabbi Steinsaltz responded to her and said, how do you know that God put your parents together for them to be happy? There may have been another reason for God to put your parents together. Maybe God put your parents together for the fruit, meaning for the children of the couple. And suddenly my daughter realized that there could be lots of reasons why people get divorced, and it doesn't necessarily reflect on the couple or on the children. In fact, the children could be the reward for this combination. Now, it happens that one time Rabbi Steinsaltz was invited to be the keynote speaker at the New York Board of Rabbis. The New York Board of Rabbis is one of these miracle organizations where all flavor rabbis get together and they all survive without killing each other. And there was an annual meeting of the New York Board of Rabbis, and Rabbi Steinsaltz was invited to give the keynote address for that particular year. Well, the mobbed. There wasn't even standing room only. There was people were out the windows and out the doors. Everybody coming to try to listen to Rabbi Steinsaltz's keynote speech that year. Rabbi Steinsaltz gets up at the podium and looks at the rabbis and says to the rabbis, Kabbalah is the official theology of the Jewish people. He said, let me repeat that. Kabbalah is the official theology of the Jewish people. He said to the rabbis, if you're not learning it, if you're not teaching it, then one could fairly say that you're not doing your job. Kabbalah is the official theology of the Jewish people. And then he proceeded for an hour and a half to defend his position and show the rabbis why it's in Kabbalistic literature that you find the basis for Jewish theology. Now, there was another time when Rabbi Steinsaltz was invited by Senator Moynihan, the late Senator Moynihan of New York, to the Senate dining room, where there was going to be a luncheon in his honor because of the Talmud volumes that were being published. Rabbi Steinsaltz, by the way, if you don't know, did something in his lifetime in our generation that has not been done for 1,000 years. It isn't since Rashi, who was born around the year 1000. Nobody since Rashi has ever written a complete, comprehensive commentary on the entire Babylonian Talmud, 63 volumes, and considered to be a work of genius. In fact, Rashi didn't even complete his commentary on the Talmud. But Rabbi Steinsaltz, in 40 years, did a Hebrew translation and commentary on the Talmud. It has now been translated into English, and it consists of 73 volumes of commentary on the Talmud, written by Rabbi Steinsaltz. So, on the occasion of the publication of the first volumes in English, Senator Moynihan threw a party for Rabbi Steinsaltz. And it was a luncheon in his honor, and many of the senators were there. A couple of Supreme Court justices were there. Some of the dignitaries in Washington who were not in the government were also there. A couple of rabbis from local congregations were also there. And the order of business was as follows. Rabbi Steinsaltz asked me if I would be his date. Would I come down to Washington with him and accompany him to this luncheon? So it was a great honor for me to be there, of course. And what happened was I was asked by the rabbi to photocopy one page of the Talmud that he had selected so that everybody in the room would have a page of Talmud. And Rabbi Steinsaltz would get up and teach that page of Talmud to the senators and to the Supreme Court justices and everybody else. So I did just what the rabbi asked me to do. I photocopied a page from the Talmud that he had told me to photocopy. And when I got to the Senate dining room, I went around and I handed out a page to each of the people who were in attendance. Rabbi Steinsaltz then got up and he taught for 10 minutes, a few lines from the Talmud. And then he sat down. I went over to my table where I was assigned a place to sit and eat. And I found that I was sitting next to a rabbi from a conservative synagogue in the Washington, D.C. area. And I got to talking to the rabbi, and I said to him, by the way, do you have a Talmud class in your synagogue? And the rabbi said to me, of course not. It would take me 10 hours to teach what Rabbi Steinsaltz just taught there in 10 minutes. Well, when the day was over, Rabbi Steinsaltz and I got back on the plane to fly back to New York, and we were sitting together. And I repeated to the rabbi this little conversation that I had with this conservative rabbi. And I asked the Rabbi Steinsaltz, what does he make of this? And he said to me, you see, there's the problem. There's the problem. People convinced this guy that he was too stupid to do it. So he doesn't do it, his congregation doesn't do it, and the Talmud isn't taught in that synagogue. My project, Rabbi Steinsaltz said, is to show people that you're not too stupid to do it. You just have to get a good translation and a good commentary, and you're able to translate and read the commentary and roll up your sleeves and study Talmud. That's what Rabbi Steinsaltz has done for us. He had a goal. His goal was to make Talmud no longer a dirty word. And you can see from the other publishers who are also brought out translations of the Talmud and scores of books and scores of classes that Rabbi Steinsaltz had reached his goal, that the Talmud is now it used to be a dirty word. They used to say, Talmudic. Talmudic would be a pejorative. It would mean, you're picking out little irrelevant details. But Rabbi Steinsaltz showed with his translation of the Talmud that no, in fact, that's not the case. In fact, the Talmud was never meant to be a closed book. It was meant to be a book read by and studied by average Jews. And Rabbi Steinsaltz, with his commentary and translation, has given us all the ability to be able to go into our studies, take a book off the shelf, roll up our sleeves, and study Talmud. Now, it happens that one year, Hadassah, the women's organization Hadassah, sponsored a one-day Talmud study class with Rabbi Steinsaltz. All of the education chair people from the various chapters of Hadassah from around the country all came to New York, and they studied Talmud with Rabbi Steinsaltz. Now, the order of business during that day was the following. The first thing was Rabbi Steinsaltz and I were going to sit together on the stage, and I was going to study Talmud with him out loud for the women there to listen to. And then we had lunch, and then after lunch, I got off the stage, and Rabbi Steinsaltz related directly to the women, answering questions and so forth. So during that first half, when I was sitting up there in front of these few hundred women speaking to Rabbi Steinsaltz about the Talmud, I asked him a question. I actually asked him two questions. One question was, it says in the Talmud that if you do a certain thing, you don't have a share in the world to come. And there are lots of different things that if you do them, the Talmud says you don't have a share in the world to come. I said to Rabbi Steinsaltz, I've done so many of those things that should I consider my life a failure? That I don't have a share in the world to come because I did some of these things? Rabbi Steinsaltz said to me, Arthur, it's clear that you haven't studied Talmud enough, because there's also lots and lots of statements which say that if you do a certain thing, your place is guaranteed in the world to come. So you have to look carefully and see what the text says. But the other question that I asked him was this. I said, Rabbi Steinsaltz, I once read in a book about the Talmud that there was some rabbi, I don't remember his name, but some rabbi said, if you read ox, the word ox in the Talmud, if you read the word ox in the Talmud and you think ox, that you're wrong. Is that the case? Rabbi Steinsaltz said, well, you have it a little mixed up. He told me the name of the rabbi who had said it, and he said the rabbi didn't say if you read ox and think ox, you're wrong. The rabbi said, if you read ox and think ox, you're probably an ox. You're probably an ox. You never take literally what the Talmud says. There's a famous passage in the Talmud about what song do you sing at the wedding of a bride and groom? What song do you sing? Do you sing that she's a beautiful and graceful bride, even if she's not so beautiful and not so graceful? And the answer that the rabbis came to is yes. You sing that same song to every bride, a beautiful and graceful bride, whether you think she's beautiful or not. So I said one day I said to Rabbi Steinsaltz, what is that about? What is that passage really about? And Rabbi Steinsaltz said to me, when you study a Talmud text, you have to crack it open, and you have to see the eternal idea that's embedded within the text. He said that passage is not really about what song do you sing at the wedding. That passage is really about white lies. Is it permissible to tell a white lie? Should you sing a beautiful and graceful bride, even if she's not so beautiful and not so graceful? And the answer is yes. It's permitted to tell a white lie to spare a person's feelings. Rabbi Steinsaltz has a chapter in his book, The 13-Petaled Rose, my favorite book in the world. It's a 180-page book. It's his introduction to Judaism, but unlike any introduction to Judaism you're ever going to find. It's not only 180 pages, but there's big type and big spaces between the lines. It's a rather short book, but it's Rabbi Steinsaltz's attempt to give the essences, the essential ideas embedded within Jewish thought. He doesn't give you the history. He doesn't give you the do's and don'ts of the religion. He doesn't give you the legends. He gives you the abstract theology that's the basis of all of Judaism and holds up Judaism. And one of the chapters in the book, to my money, the easiest chapter, some of the chapters are quite tough, but the easiest chapter in the book is a chapter called The Way of Choice. The Way of Choice. And what Rabbi Steinsaltz says in this chapter, The Way of Choice, is that we cannot say that any human emotion or characteristic is positive or negative. That every human emotion is positive or negative, not by what it is intrinsically, but how it's used. So, for example, honesty. Honesty is not good. Sometimes honesty is absolutely the wrong thing for the moment. You don't go into the hospital and say, Grandma, you look worse than you did yesterday. Sometimes honesty is not the right attitude for that particular moment. And Rabbi Steinsaltz explains in this book that this is the way of Judaism. It's called the way of choice. That what we have to do in our lives is we have to encounter every incident, every moment of our lives, and decide what does this moment require. You can't look at a list of good values and bad values. Sometimes honesty is good. Sometimes honesty is bad. Sometimes humility is good. Sometimes humility is not so good. There are all kinds of things in life that our tradition teaches us. We have to study and study and learn and study and study and study. And then at a certain point, we close the book and we go outside and we have to live. And there's no book that'll give us every answer to every question that we can anticipate. Rather, we have to learn some of the principles and be able to then decide for ourselves. This is the way of choice. Now, when you look at Rabbi Steinsaltz's edition of the Talmud, I remember once there was a press conference that was ran on that Random House, who were the original publishers, organized for Rabbi Steinsaltz. And at this press conference, one of the reporters raised his hand and said, "Who do you think you are, writing a commentary on the Talmud? What gives you the right to write a commentary on the Talmud?" And Rabbi Steinsaltz, with a puzzled look, said to him, "What do you mean, who am I to write a commentary on the Talmud? Every school child is supposed to write their commentary on the Talmud." He said, "My chutzpah is not writing a commentary on the Talmud. My chutzpah was getting it published. But each of us is supposed to write a commentary on the Talmud." And for example, if you were to take one page of Rabbi Steinsaltz's Talmud edition and compare it to one page of, let's say, the Art Scroll translation, you'll notice that in the Art Scroll edition, almost every place on the page is filled with text. In Rabbi Steinsaltz's edition of the Talmud, there's a lot of white spaces. And it's not that he couldn't fill in those white spaces, but rather that he's saying to the readers, you have to bring yourself to the text. Rabbi Steinsaltz once wrote a book called The Essential Talmud. And The Essential Talmud has a chapter at the end of the book that's called "The Talmud Was Never Completed." When you read the chapter, you find out that it doesn't mean that they got interrupted and didn't complete it. It means that the Talmud was never completed, meaning that you and I have to go to the Talmud and we have to complete it. We have to bring our point of view to the text, particularly in our generation when women are studying Talmud. In past generations, it was a boys' club. Now that it's far more open than that, we need the points of view of women. We need the points of view of everybody in the community, and that white space on the page is devoted to people bringing their commentary to the text as well. Now, I see that I don't have that much time, and I have lots more to say. Let me just look at my notes, and I want to say a couple of very quick one-liners that the rabbi has said. One is that the Talmud is a photograph of a fountain. The Talmud is a photograph of a fountain. What does that mean? It means that the fountain keeps bubbling up. The Talmud is like one frozen moment. But you don't look at the Talmud text and treat it like it's a frozen moment. It's a photograph of a fountain. The fountain moves. The points of view that the rabbis express in the Talmud change, and they meet each other and talk to each other. One of the rabbi's famous sayings is, if you think you've arrived, you're lost. If you think you've arrived, you're lost. Once Rabbi Steinsaltz was asked, what is faith? What is faith? And Rabbi Steinsaltz says, well, it's like a certain theorem in geometry. There's a theorem in geometry, not plane geometry, but geometry having the cones that move. There's a theorem in geometry called Desargues' theorem. Now, if you were to look up in an encyclopedia or even a dictionary, Desargues' theorem, it's not very difficult to understand. It's a rather simple theorem. The problem, Rabbi Steinsaltz said, with Desargues' theorem is that you can't prove it. You can't prove this simple theorem until you imagine a point in the infinite. And when you imagine a point in the infinite, then you can very easily solve this and prove this theorem. Rabbi Steinsaltz said to me, that's what faith is. Faith is bringing into the equation of your life God, the infinite. Without the infinite, it's impossible. With the infinite, things become much more possible, just like in Desargues' theorem. So I want to tell one more story, and then hopefully we can take some questions. I'm sitting on the subway, on the F train of the subway, going from my office in Manhattan to my apartment in Brooklyn. I no longer live in Brooklyn, but at the time, that's where I was living. And I'm reading this book, The 13-Petaled Rose. And there's a chassid sitting next to me. And he's reading the New York Post. And I'm feeling very good about myself because I grew up in a household that did not offer me a Jewish education. And yet here I am reading a book of Kabbalah by Rabbi Steinsaltz. And there's the chassid sitting next to me, and he's reading the New York Post of all things. But my first Talmud teacher taught me that you shouldn't go 2 cubits. A cubit is from your elbow to your finger. You shouldn't travel 2 cubits with a fellow Jew without talking Torah. And there was the subway going by, and I'm not talking to my fellow Jew sitting next to me until I got enough courage up, and I thought, I want to talk to this. I said to him, excuse me. He puts down his newspaper, and I said to him, have you ever seen this book? He looks at the book, and he said, no, he's never seen it. And I said, well, there's a passage in the book that I'd like to read to you. Can I read it to you? And I have a question for you about it. It's a basic book on Judaism, and this is the passage. It has been said that each of the letters of the Torah has some corresponding soul. That is to say, every soul is a letter in the entire Torah and has its own part to play. The soul that has fulfilled its task, what it has to do in terms of creating or repairing its own part of the world and realizing its own essence, that soul can wait after death for the perfection of the world as a whole. But not all souls are so privileged. Many souls stray for one reason or another. Sometimes a person does not do all the proper things. Sometimes he misuses forces and he spoils his portion and the portion of others. In such a case, the soul does not complete its task, and may even itself be damaged by contact with the world. It has not managed to complete that portion of reality which only this particular soul can complete. And therefore, after the death of the body, the soul returns and is reincarnated in the body of another person, and again must try and complete what it failed to correct or what it injured in the past. I said to the chassid sitting next to me, do we believe this? He said, of course. I said, Jews believe in reincarnation? I never heard of it. He said to me, well, where did you get your Jewish education? And I told him, well, I didn't get much of a Jewish education. He said, well, that's why you never heard of it. But I've gone through hundreds of books on Judaism in the public library. I never see a mention of reincarnation. And yet, Rabbi Steinsaltz, the great Talmud scholar of our generation, is telling me in this very slim book that reincarnation is an essential part of Jewish theology. I learned that day that you should talk to your fellow Jews if you're going 2 cubits together. You might get some benefit out of it. So it looks like we only have 10 minutes left. I was asked to give 15 minutes to questions, so I apologize. And I have so much more to share, but at this point, I wonder whether or not it's time for us to take some questions.
Yeah, I think it would be wonderful to hear from people. These were superlative anecdotes and very, very much to the character of Rabbi Steinsaltz. Can you tell us, for those of us who are not versed in his biography, a little bit about his background and how he came to do what he did, and at what age, let's say, or what stage in his development, his mission switched from, as all of ours, right, learning to teaching, when he first sort of existed in what we would call in Kabbalah expanded consciousness.
Yes, well, in fact, it's a great question, because many people don't know that Rabbi Steinsaltz grew up in a household that was not observant. He grew up in a household where his mother and father were socialists. In fact, he once said to me, Arthur, he said, I'm a big skeptic. My mother was a skeptic. My father was a skeptic. They brought me up to be a skeptic. Rabbi Steinsaltz said to me, I'm such a skeptic that I even became skeptical of skepticism. And that's how I became religious. But when he was 14 years old, Rabbi Steinsaltz's father hired a tutor to teach him Talmud.
Where was this?
In Jerusalem. Rabbi Steinsaltz was born in Jerusalem and has lived his whole life in Jerusalem. So the question is, why would a socialist who doesn't believe in God, who doesn't observe any of the traditions, why would he hire a tutor for his son to study Talmud? And Rabbi Steinsaltz said to me that my father believed that, he said, I don't care if my children are heretics. I just don't want them to be ignoramuses. And so from that point on, Rabbi Steinsaltz was studying Talmud. He then started studying other things, and very rapidly he became a religious Jew.
When did he start teaching, and in what capacity? How did that develop? Because not everybody who studies feels equipped to teach or is equipped to teach. He clearly was. Did he start teaching in small groups? Was he a yeshiva rebbe? When I knew him, he was teaching at a small place in Nachaot. I don't know if at what stage. That was a late stage, I guess. But
yeah, he started teaching when he was 20 years old. Imagine that he started studying when he was 14, and he started teaching when he was 20, and he was teaching students who were 80 years old, who were steeped in Torah learning, because Rabbi Steinsaltz was this genius. He was extraordinary in personality who was able to teach. The first president of Israel was one of his students. He had a lot of illustrious students. He then, at age 25, he became the principal of the youngest principal of any school in Israel. So his career as a teacher started very, very young, and people gathered around him. More and more people gathered around him, and then he started his Talmud commentary, never thinking that it would take him 40 years to complete. But he spent those 40 years, among other things, writing this commentary on the Talmud. He's also written a commentary on the Torah, on on all of Tanakh. He's written a commentary on the Tanya, the great classic Hasidic work, the Tanya. He's also written a commentary on the Book of Psalms. He's just being published now is a commentary he wrote on Maimonides' Mishnah Torah.
So very, very broad, but I think a lot of our listeners know him as, you know, the expositor of the Talmud par excellence. I have two questions and I want to open up for everybody else because I don't want to hog the time. One, can you briefly, because if anyone can, you can, describe, compare and contrast the Steinsaltz approach with the Art Scroll approach? Being l'shevach, in praise of everyone, and not lignai, okay, as much as you can, and not negative.
The essential difference between the two is that Rabbi Steinsaltz wants the reader, the student of his edition of the Talmud, to participate. In the Art Scroll, everything is spoon-fed. The Art Scroll, everything is explained. Rabbi Steinsaltz doesn't explain everything, not because he wants to keep knowledge from us, but because part of the study of Talmud is getting your feet wet, jump and participating. So, like I said before, there's a lot of white space in Rabbi Steinsaltz's Talmud. Also, Rabbi Steinsaltz gives minority views a lot, whereas the Art Scroll is mostly giving you what the majority view was.
Right, right.
So it's a much more open-minded document.
Yeah, I always found it to be that way. I always thought that Art Scroll expressed a particular party line or doctrine. Tybal writes to me, there's an anecdote from Avram Infeld, apropos of not wanting to be an Am Haaretz. Avram Infeld quotes his father, blessed memory, as saying, "I'm an atheist, Baruch Hashem." And listen, so what were, you spoke at the very beginning about these 11 questions that you had for Rabbi Steinsaltz. And you said that he answered 9 in the first meeting. What were the others that he didn't answer? And this is a question from a listener. And what would you have to say about those?
Okay, well, some of the questions are very, very personal, but I can give 2 questions. One of them was, I said, Rabbi Steinsaltz, I've been dabbling in Eastern religions for a long time, Buddhism and Hinduism. I've been reading a lot of books on the subject. I said I never belonged to a group, but like many people my age in the late 60s and early 70s, we were getting involved with learning about Eastern religions. And I said to Rabbi Steinsaltz, after reading these books, I then go to the 13 Petaled Rose, your book of Jewish theology, and I see that so much of it is the same. How could it be? Rabbi Steinsaltz looked at me puzzled and he said, how could it be otherwise? How could it be otherwise? That truth is truth. And when you're exploring life, it only stands to reason that these similarities. He said, Judaism is not a Western religion. Judaism is an Eastern religion. So that's one question that he asked, that I asked him. But the other question I asked him, again, remember that this was in 1981 when I first spoke with him, and I asked him, what does he think about smoking marijuana? Now, this was a time when it was that it was severely illegal to certainly to sell it, also to have it on your person. Marijuana was illegal. Today, things have opened up considerably. But I said to Rabbi Steinsaltz, what do you think of marijuana? And he said to me, well, first of all, I never tried it, so I can't tell you anything about it from personal experience. But he said, there are 2 problems with marijuana. He said, one is a small problem and one is a big problem. The small problem is the principle of dina malchuta dina, which means the law of the land is the law. So if marijuana is illegal, then you should avoid doing things that are illegal. But he said, that's not the important thing. The important thing is the other question about marijuana. And that is not only a question about marijuana, but a question about everything in life. And the question is, who is the master and who is the slave?
Absolutely. Yeah.
He said, if you're the slave, then it's bad. He said, you can be a slave to coffee. You can be a slave to tobacco. He said, even a slave to Torah study.
Yes.
But if you're the master, that's a different situation. Who's the master? Who is the slave?
The slave often doesn't know that they're the slave, right? And they think, I'm okay. I know when I've had enough, so that's an issue, but that is the problem. That's the question. And, of your questions, du hast gut gefragt, it's harder to ask a good question sometimes than to give a good answer. So these were very, very stimulating questions. A listener asks, what was the very last thing you learned from Rabbi Steinsaltz before he passed away?
It's emotional. I'm sorry, it's emotional to think about.
It's okay. If you feel you can answer, then answer.
The day before, Rabbi Steinsaltz had a stroke, and then 2 years later he died. The day before he had a stroke, he was invited by the Pope to go to Rome to have a conversation with the Pope. And he had this conversation, and again, the very next day he had a stroke. He said to me, he told his son, who told me, that Rabbi Steinsaltz said to the Pope, for too long, we've been doing the cha-cha. We should do the tango instead. That for too long, the Catholics and Christians and Jews have been one step forward, one step back, one step forward, one step back. We have to do the mambo instead. We have to get together and do that. So that was the last thing that got communicated to me. I also want to say, though, that the rabbi's son, who told me about this meeting between the Pope and Rabbi Steinsaltz, the last thing that the Pope said to Rabbi Steinsaltz when they said goodbye is the Pope said, please pray for me.
Mm-hmm.
Please pray for me. For me, it's very touching to think of.
It is. It's very touching for me to see somebody, I said at the outset that it's an unusual experience to be in the presence of a truly wise person. We're very often in the presence of people who consider themselves wise, and we ourselves consider ourselves wise, unless we're wise enough not to consider ourselves wise. But it's also a privilege and a pleasure to be in the presence of a Talmud Muvhak, that is somebody who's a true student, right? Somebody who absorbs and is able to transmit back the best category, according to the Gemara, as you know, of studenthood. And you really seem to have harvested the lessons of Rabbi Steinsaltz and project them. And that's, I think, the greatest gift that a student can give to one's Rebbe. And I think that you do that. I think you would be very proud. I think that the idea that your book was not the Rabbi Steinsaltz that his colleagues knew, that's the tell. That really shows you that it's a great book. And I wish that you go Michael L'Chael, from strength to increased strength. And that, it's, how can I say it? I often give this example. What just happened? What just happened? Well, if you were watching, you'll say, I scratched my nose, right? Well, I scratched my nose, that was history. History happened. But history happened, and it's, as soon as it happens, it's seen through all kinds of lenses. And as soon as we articulate, open our mouths to talk about history, it becomes something else. It becomes historiography, history writing, or history telling. And in the end, because history passes, right? The moment passes. The person, Chabal, right? Nebuch, passes, right? What's left is the stories we tell about the person. And you, Arthur, really embody what a Maggid about the life of a great figure should be doing. You come to it with humility. You record his humility. You see all angles of him, including his humor and all his greatness. So I'm very, very grateful to you for joining us today. And if anybody has any other questions, we can take maybe one more, and if not, we'll thank Arthur Kurzweil again. Okay. Well, stay tuned. CSP will be back tomorrow. Yes. Oh, thank you, Pat. And we have a lot of thanks coming in. So CSP will be back tomorrow, as I told you, with another wonderful presentation. You have links to all of our materials, including the 13-petal rose mentioned in the talk, and the quote that Rabbi Kurzweil quoted, which I live tweeted on page 63 and 64. And please join us tomorrow at 12:30 p.m. PDT for Jewish Ukraine with Evgenia Kempinski, part 2, Kiev, Odessa, and Dnipro. And we'll see you, in fact, on Thursday again, and then on Tuesday again. So it's been wonderful to see you. And again, I apologize for being slightly late to get to the session today. The Taconic Parkway is probably as unreliable as some LA roads. All right. Peace. Shalom Aleichem. Be well. Take care.
Thank you.
Kol tuv. Bye-bye.